Hey, check, 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 check. Hey, testing 1, 2. Check, check, 1, 2. Hey, hey, check 1, 2, 2, 2. Hey, hey, 1, 2. Check 1, 2. Hey, hey, hey. Hey, check, check 1, 2. You getting level? Hey, check. Sorry, check, check 1, 2. Hey, hey. Okay.
closest, where it says WC. Good morning, everyone. You're welcome to keep mingling and have your coffee in the back, but if we can have your attention so we can get started. I'm Tom Nagorski. Thank you for being with us on a lovely September morning, which marks, among other things, well, it's the September edition of our Asia Briefing series here at the Asia Society, but also the first event in our September season of programming. We always hope that these gatherings are timely. We minted this one a while ago. Yeah, it wasn't meant as a laugh line, but yes. We actually, just a few hours ago, if you haven't heard the news, there was perhaps a bit of good news that there will be another round of talks next month on the subject we'll be getting into here. Timely, and we also want top flight guests whenever we can get them. And so we are timely today, and certainly our guest this morning is as qualified as anybody to talk about the issues that have brought us to wherever we stand right now. We'll find out in a moment with the U.S.-China trade war. Just a couple of quick notes on days and weeks ahead. In that September series of programs here, we launch a new exhibition in our galleries next week. The show is called Shaozi Shi. My apologies, Shaozi Shi, Objects of Evidence. This is an artist whose paintings and photography trace the history of banned books in China. The artist will be here Monday night, the 9th, for a special conversation with Asia Society members. That's an invitation this morning for any of you who are not members. You join before then, or even just arrive and join and you're in. Our first Free Friday celebration of the fall is a week from tomorrow, the 13th. Lots of fun and food and drink and curated tours of that exhibition. And then I should note that the week of September 23rd is the week of the UN General Assembly sessions, when New York crawls to a traffic standstill and the whole world comes to this city. I can't give away names and countries just yet, but in the days to come, and probably early next week, I can assure you that we will have a rather remarkable and perhaps for us unprecedented slate of leaders from across Asia here at the Asia Society. As I say, probably a press release next week. You can watch asiasociety.org for details, but we can assure you that if you are interested, as I assume you all are because you're here, in meeting and hearing from the leaders of that part of the world, this is the place to be in late September. And lastly, beyond September, mark October the 24th on your calendars. That is the date of the 6th Annual Asia Game Changer Awards. This has grown into quite a large and I would say the word we like to use a lot here, inspiring enterprise, where we honor people who have had really transformative impact across the Asia Pacific. The event is on the 24th. Again, another press release coming next week, but I can tell you that it's an incredible group. For the first time, all the honorees will be women. Yay. Tickets are on sale for the big gala celebration, which is that night, and it is, among other things, a great way to support the work we do here. Okay, let's get to the matter at hand. Not long ago, we weren't using the term, and we are conscious of this sort of thing, trade war, at least those of us who work here. Wendy actually was among those who cautioned me that it seemed a little too strong. I think yeah, look at that. When we put up the flyer for this event, we called it the U.S.-China trade dispute because it seemed things were muddling along and various prognosticators felt it's going to be okay, we're headed for a deal. And now, well, I don't want to, take words from your mouth, and I don't even know where you think that the words should land now, but trade war, to me anyway, seems about right. We have increasing evidence that it is hurting many people in this country, ripple effects being felt around the world and certainly in Asia and in global markets. And it is, without question, done damage to the overall U.S.-China relationship. We'll get to all that in a moment. Our guest this morning, you have her bio, and many of you have met her here before. Wendy Cutler is Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute, Managing Director of our office in Washington. She joined us after nearly 3 decades as a diplomat and a negotiator in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. And among other things, she negotiated the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, the TPP, and relevant to today, she's got a lot of experience in negotiating on these matters with the Chinese. When we brought Wendy Cutler to the Asia Society, we knew we had a great get and a great find and a great mind for the policy team. I don't think any of us imagined just how, back to that word, timely and just how often we would be dealing with issues here that are exactly smack in the wheelhouse of Wendy's expertise and experience. I should note, by the way, that Wendy's team at the Policy Institute this week has issued the latest edition of its China dashboard. It's online, and I think there may be copies in the back. It's a sophisticated tracker of China's economic reforms, so also very relevant to the conversation today. As always with these events, we are live streaming them, so if you have questions and are not sitting in this room at the moment, you can send them by email to moderator@asiasociety.org or tweet them using the hashtag AsiaSocietyLive. So Wendy Cutler, great to have you here as always, and we thought we'd set the stage, as the title says, where things stand, because it seemed, to me anyway, that even someone who reads a lot of these dizzying headlines day in, day out about what's going on can be forgiven for not really grasping just the scale and the scope and some would say the gravity of the things that have happened just in the last couple of weeks. So I think we want to turn your attention to the screen, and Wendy, maybe you can just talk us through this quick state of play document you've got.
Okay. Well, first, thanks everyone for coming out this morning, and thanks to Tom. I'm thrilled and honored to be launching, I guess, our fall program, our fall season of programming, and I love that trade issues are #1 on the agenda. One thing I've learned since I've worked in the Asia Society and do a lot of public speaking is always check the media before you come and do any event, particularly if you're working on trade issues, because there seem to be breaking news all the time. Some of it seems to be truly breaking. Some of it seems to be kind of boring, but people find it breaking. And this morning, clearly, when I saw the flashing, breaking email on my iPhone that the U.S. and China have agreed to meet again in the next few weeks. China has announced the meeting will be in early October. The U.S. is just saying in the next few weeks, but a meeting will be happening. I also have to say is that I think the bar's gotten pretty low in that a meeting is announced and now the stock market responds and the markets all around the world, but we can get to that in a while. When Tom and I were discussing this event, he asked me, well, can you talk about the, the state of play? And I was trying to explain to him all these different tariffs that are in place and the new ones that have been promised, et cetera. So we agreed that I would try and put this on one piece of paper and use a slide and try and walk through it. I will, do my best. What I will tell you is there's not going to be any quiz on these numbers, and some of them are still trying to be worked out, and I'll explain to you some of the difficulty in quantifying this. So in short, what we've seen in the U.S.-Japan trade dispute is basically, the U.S.-China trade dispute is a back and forth on imposing tariffs against each other. The United States started in July 2018 and followed in August with what I would call kind of the first tranche of tariffs valued at $50 billion. And the key about the first tranche of tariffs is that the United States tried very hard to limit those tariffs to industrial goods and goods that were high-tech and fell under the rubric of China's Made in China 2025 plan. China didn't miss a beat and retaliated. Now, the interesting thing, when China has retaliated throughout this negotiation and throughout this saga, they've responded in kind. So China in July and August responded also with tariffs on $50 billion worth of U.S. imports. And then what we saw in September was that this was ratcheted up significantly, given that progress wasn't being made in the negotiations. And while the U.S. added tariffs on an additional $200 billion worth of tariffs, China responded with only applying tariffs on $60 billion worth of tariffs. One of the reasons why China at this point really kind of pivoted and retaliated on a smaller number is that U.S. exports to China are significantly less than Chinese exports to the United States. Now, this tariff war seemed to be in place and things were kind of calm until September 1, this past weekend, and this is where we've seen a significant ratcheting up of the tariff action. Just this past weekend, the United States now has put tariffs on an additional $112 billion worth of Chinese imports at the rate of 15%. And one of the keys here is that these really affect consumer goods for the first time. They're largely consumer products. They include clothing, shoes, sporting goods, and the list goes on and on. China has responded, and here it gets, you'll see I don't have any dollar figures here, and I just put the number of products that China is hitting, by largely increasing tariffs on products that it's already hit, including agriculture, but also adding oil. So as of today, where things stand, the United States has tariffs imposed on $362 billion worth of Chinese imports, and China has tariffs on somewhere around a little over $110 billion worth of U.S. imports. Now, and here I'll just get to what is on the plate, what's in the offing, and that is the president has announced 2 further tariff increases to take place this fall. On October 1, 2019, he has said that he will take the $250 billion worth of tariffs that were imposed between July 2018 and September 2018, which are now at 25%, he'll increase them to 30%. And then on December 1, he will complete the retaliation, and this will cover virtually now all Chinese imports, and impose 15% tariffs on an additional $160 billion worth of Chinese imports. And these will also be consumer goods, but largely the goods that involve a lot of Christmas purchases, so this would kind of go past the holiday season. And that would include toys, consumer electronics, and other products. And if all of this takes place, we would basically have tariffs in place on about 97% of all Chinese imports. Now for China, what China has said for the future, that as of December 1, they will have tariffs in place on basically 69 or about 70% of U.S. products, about $75 billion worth of additional tariffs. And so you can see that this is a pretty significant tit for tat back and forth. And I guess one of the questions today we can discuss is, given that a new round of tariffs, a new round of negotiations has just been announced, will the future tariff increases really take place, or might the president postpone them, or might he hike them if he doesn't like the progress? All uncertain at this point.
So, first of all, I'm very glad there's not a quiz, because
is this all clear?
I'm listening, yeah. But I would fail. But just, you just used the word uncertain. And if we can take this for a second out of, these really stark, and the number that really sticks out for me is we may pretty soon be at 97% of all Chinese imports. There's been a lot of press lately about the impact beginning to be felt, and it's all anecdotal, but in the boardrooms and just, in offices around the country, small businesses, big ones, who are listening and watching, and uncertainty is, can you talk a little bit about how, if you are, again, whether you're, just one end of your supply chain is over there, or you're a big company, a small one that does a little bit of, there's a great thing about Columbia Sportswear, I think you mentioned apparel, and the guy was on vacation and watching the tweets and everything else just last weekend. What does that, beyond the anecdotal, President Trump has said many times that, we can win this thing, we can win a trade war. What's the chance or the risk that all that anecdotal stuff starts to add up to real pain in this country economically? Yeah.
Well, first of all the anecdotal stuff on the impact of these tariffs is clearly adding up. We don't have the numbers, and a lot of, you'll see different people coming up with different numbers. There have been estimates of how much these tariffs will cost consumers, a family per year, some of those numbers in the range of $800 to $1,000 per family per year. And there are also other figures out there about what it's costing small businesses, other businesses, business earnings. But all those numbers are still kind of anecdotal, and no one's really brought them together so we really understand the impact. But let's just keep in mind, our economy is huge. So even though China is, our trade relationship with China is big as well, the impact of trade on an economy as big as ours is going to be, if you look at the overall macroeconomic numbers, it's, not going to be, as significant as people would think. But I think you've put your finger on something that I just constantly hear about, and that is, how do you quantify the uncertainty that's being created by this trading relationship and this back and forth tariff? And here I'm really just focused on tariff actions, but other actions are being taken by both countries, not just limited to the trade space and the technology space, for example, but also, for example, China is finding other ways beyond tariffs to hurt our companies and to affect things. And so I think if you talk to businesses, particularly small and medium-sized businesses, it's really hard to plan for all of this because you don't really know where this is headed. I think for a while, people were hedging their bets thinking, this looks like, okay, yeah, there's a lot of drama, there's a lot of back and forth, but eventually a negotiated settlement will be reached, and if not all the tariffs will be lifted right away, it looks like, that's where we might be headed. But I think now that it's continued month after month, this is really forcing businesses to make decisions based on really uncertain information. A lot of people, and the president will say, well, this is the wake-up call for all our companies to basically come back to the United States. Well, number one, that's not happening, but companies are definitely trying to diversify their sourcing, diversify their export markets, but that's complicated too. It's not like you just pick up your plant and you decide you're going to move to Vietnam tomorrow. There are a lot of, there's a long-term process setting up supply chains, and they can't be kind of unwound overnight. Now, some industries it's easier to unwind those supply chains than other industries. But when I talk, for example, to some like electronics companies, it's really difficult. And I would add to that, it's uncertain which market to go to, because China has a lot of skilled labor, they have a great infrastructure. There are a lot of reasons why they went to China, and it's hard to find another market that can absorb a lot of these requests and statements of interest about relocating.
Right. And I guess depending on what it is you manufacture and what your exposure is, your other alternative then is just to pass costs to consumers, which, right.
Yeah.
By the way, you mentioned Vietnam. You've just mentioned back in the room there something else about Vietnam, which is kind of interesting byproduct of this, because there's a ripple effect there that's pretty profound. Can you just share?
Yeah, when you look at the data on Vietnam, and I hope I have this right, and I think this is based on their data, but for the first 8 months of this year, their bilateral trade deficit with the United States has increased by 40%, and their foreign direct investment has increased by 30%. And most of that foreign direct investment, frankly, is coming from China and Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and also the United States. But the United States isn't, one of the top 3 FDI partners for this new round of investment in Vietnam. But what's interesting with Vietnam is that because its bilateral trade deficit is growing with the United States, and this administration, let's remember, they don't like bilateral trade deficits. All of a sudden, Vietnam feels like it's kind of in the crossfire of a potential trade dispute with the United States. And on top of it, what's also happening as businesses look to relocate some of their production or their, what they would call their export, the country from which they're exporting, there is concern that a number of these companies are circumventing the trade rules, going to these countries like Vietnam, just kind of crossing out made in China and crossing out the China and just putting Vietnam on the label, and then sending it from Vietnam and saying it's not subject to a tariff. So there's also concern that the circumvention's going on, and Vietnam in response is now kind of upping its kind of customs enforcement in response to concerns raised by the United States.
Wow, okay. I mentioned in the open that you've had, Wendy, you know, most biographies you see of hers will always have Trans-Pacific Partnership next to it, or maybe the U.S.-Korea trade agreement. But as I said, relevant to today, you've done a lot in your life of negotiating across the table from the Chinese on exactly these kinds of issues. So what strikes you as you watch it now as an observer, as an Asia Society Policy Institute vice president? What are some of your reflections? What strikes you as similar, familiar, and what's really different?
And this would, it's a good question. I think this, I would limit it not just to my experience with U.S.-China, but just more broadly negotiating trade agreements. I will say, as I read the papers and hear about each round of negotiation, there's a little PTSD I'm experiencing. Because there are just common threads in trade negotiations. Like, first of all, there's just a lot of drama. All of these negotiations, there's ups and downs, things break off, you're not talking, you're talking, you're threatening things, your leaders are going to meet and you don't even know what they're going to say. So a lot of that is just, common to most trade negotiations. What strikes me in the U.S.-China negotiation is just a few things. Number one, the stakes are so high here. Two of the largest trading partners, the largest economies in the world, and how they work out or don't work out their trade relationship is not just going to be limited to trade, which will be impactful. It's going to impact all other parts of our relationship. So the stakes are extremely high in this negotiation. Second, I've never been in a negotiation where so many tariffs are in place, hurting so many people. And so that, that just distinguishes this negotiation. But also in this negotiation, unlike others, is that if things don't work out in the U.S.-China trade world, we're not going to go back to the status quo. And so let me just contrast this with negotiating with Korea, let's just say, on a free trade agreement. We worked really hard to negotiate a free trade agreement with Korea. There were times during those talks we thought this thing was never going to happen. And if it didn't happen, yeah, it wouldn't be great. We were two allies, but we would kind of muddle through our trade relationship and we would still continue to be strong allies. But I think with China, if somehow this totally breaks down, we're not going to go back to where we were. We're going to have to define a whole new relationship. And I don't think it's going to be a positive one. And so I would argue the stakes are enormously high. Now, in terms of the negotiations themselves, I think that this negotiation has some unique attributes that, in my mind, really complicate things for negotiators. Number one, it's a very top-down negotiation. So, any negotiation I've been worked on, the presidents were always involved and knew what was going on with respect to the most important issues. I think in this negotiation, no one would dispute that the president is kind of watching all of this, and then depending how he feels on any certain day, may respond and ask his folks to do something. And here I would just put on people's, just mention, just a few weeks ago, the president decided that we should call China a currency manipulator. We have a statute that actually has 3 criteria for naming any country a currency manipulator, and China didn't live up to those 3 criteria. And so, but the president decided, and his cabinet officials and other officials then came up with the narrative in order to call them a currency manipulator. But if you look at the facts of their currency movement, if anything, they have been working hard not to allow their currency to fall. So it's a very top-down negotiation, which also means that a lot of even his cabinet officials, but people under the cabinet, people like me who negotiated for both Republican and Democratic presidents, they're not empowered to really negotiate. And they don't really, if you're at the negotiating table with them, they have to check everything. Now, the cabinet officers have more leeway, but we've even seen we've seen Secretary Ross, Secretary Mnuchin, and at times Secretary Lighthizer the president has undermined all three of them in these negotiations. So the top-down nature, the public nature of this negotiation.
Right.
I mean, one thing I've learned in negotiations is the quieter everyone is, the better. Because, and particularly with Asian countries where saving face is so important, when this is all done in the public and things are said and you can't take them back, it's very hard to get things back on track. And then finally, I would say, is that this negotiation, I've just been struck by the real significant miscommunication and misreading of each side of the other. This always happens. We never know the other side as well as they know themselves. But here, just all through this negotiation, there seems to have just been, key junctures where each side just totally misread the other side. And here, I think the Chinese really misread the United States. And I think China, up until 18 months ago, really thought it could just purchase a lot of our stuff and this would be over. Mm-hmm. And it took them a while to really pivot and to understand that they needed to also address market access and mm-hmm. structural issues and deal with an enforcement mechanism. So those are some of the kind of, elements I would point to that would distinguish this negotiation from others.
So we want to get to your questions in a couple of minutes, but that point's really interesting. It gets us to really how this all began. And two people you didn't mention, I don't think, are Peter Navarro and Steve Bannon, who many would say are, maybe not the architects of this, but they certainly were the key drivers from the beginning of a point of view, paraphrasing here, but I think they would say, and certainly the president would say, the president said or tweeted just, I think, a week or 10 days ago in response to all this uncertainty stuff, that the people who are complaining, the business owners who are complaining, are just bad managers. And they don't, so put that aside. But from the beginning, the other point, fundamental one, was it's about time that this country stood up to the Chinese on these issues. Whether it is the level playing field or absence of one for American businesses in that country, the currency issue, all kinds of questions about sensitive technology. So did they have a point? Do they have a point? And perhaps the Chinese did the misreading you just talked about because they were used to previous administrations that didn't quite insist on the things that the government is insisting on now.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that there really, in the United States now, there is strong bipartisan support for really changing our relationship with China, being more realistic with respect to where China is coming from, and realistic that they're not going to become a market economy or fall more in line with the principles we want them to follow. So therefore, we need a much tougher policy which calls them out, and basically forces them to change, or our market is no longer going to be open to them. I think, again, there's a lot of, with respect to the objectives of this policy in terms of really trying to call China out and get this relationship on fairer ground, there's a lot of support for that in the country. I support that. Where I question and others question is it's the tactics for getting there. Mm-hmm. And I think there the president has one tool that he continues to use, and that's the tool of tariffs. I think, I'm not a fan of tariffs. We're breaking our trading rules, we're hurting ourselves. But I do think that particularly with China, the initial imposition of tariffs, and particularly that initial $50 billion of tariffs we put into place, which were really thought out and were really in response to China's Made in 2025 industries and how they were supporting them, I think those tariffs really succeeded in getting China to the negotiating table and getting China to negotiate in earnest. But since then, I think there has been kind of a diminishing return. And I don't see, it's a year and a half later, or 14 months later, I don't see these tariffs kind of leading to that negotiated solution. We've seen China, instead of saying, okay, don't put the tariffs in, we're going to negotiate, we're going to make major concessions, their response has been, we're going to match you, and frankly, we're going to get ready domestically and do what we need to do to weather the storm. And so what my view is that in any, if I were asked what should our policy be on China trade, I think it's really a combination of a number of different policy tools. And I think the one area where we really, I think, mismanaged is the area of working with other like-minded countries, our partners and our allies, in trying to have more of a united front working with China. And I think China would probably respond better to, a coalition of countries urging it to, level the playing field and get rid of its unfair trade practices. I'm not naive. I don't think, some people will say, well, that should be our whole policy. I don't think so, but I think we should put more weight on that policy. But unfortunately, in trade, what we've done is we've also hit these like-minded countries on their own trade issues, which has left them less of an appetite, frankly, to work with us earnestly on the China issues.
So that's a lot of cautionary notes there, and dialing back to what you said at the outset about, markets may, when Wall Street opens in about a half an hour, they may cheer the news of talks, but both because of the points you just made, but in particular, so Liu He and Bob Lighthizer sit across from one another, and the point about how, how do the Chinese feel that, how do they judge that what the USTR is telling them is really going to be the ultimate, something that they can take home and take to the bank. Given all that, what's a roadmap for some kind of good outcome that you can see realistically? I'm not, when they sit down, if they do sit down in early October.
So, I continue to believe that a negotiated solution on these issues is possible. I think I was more optimistic a number of months ago than I am now, but I still think it is possible. I think when you look at the calendar, the upcoming November APEC meeting in Chile will be the next occasion for a meeting between Presidents Trump and Xi. So if I were trying to kind of work on a roadmap, trying to lead towards some progress or some kind of deal, I would kind of keep that meeting out there and really try and use these next negotiating rounds to try and, really make some progress. I was heartened by the announcement this morning because not only did they announce a new ministers level meeting at the Liu Lighthizer level, but they also said that the vice ministers would be working in the lead up to that meeting. And I can't stress enough for this audience how important a lot of that working level work is, because that helps tee up the issues for the ministers or later for the leaders. I think what would be extremely helpful now, once again, is for both sides to kind of quiet down and kind of agree that, I don't know how you do this with our president who likes to tweet, but kind of agree that, we're going to kind of, be quiet now and let the negotiators do their work. I think there are things that both sides could do quietly as goodwill gestures. For example, the United States could start approving some of the licenses that U.S. companies have submitted for sales to Huawei in the non-national security arena. The U.S., too, could delay its October 1 tariffs. I mentioned that on October 1, the president plans to, lift the $250 billion of tariffs from 25% to 30%. China, on the other hand, I think, could just quietly start buying more of our agricultural products without a big splash. Just start buying, and we'll start recognizing. Mm-hmm. Or China could say, for example, that they're not going to take any tariff action on our auto and auto parts. That's something they did a year ago. Now they've just announced they're going to be slapping tariffs on that sector. I think that would be welcomed by the administration. And I think if you could kind of establish, a better atmosphere, and you had some of these gestures and actions taken, then the two sides could get back to that actual negotiating text, which fell apart last May. And, they had made a lot of progress. And so the key is to find out how to get back to that text and, just try and resolve those handful at that time of outstanding issues.
And just one quick follow-up, and then I promise we'll come to the audience. But I don't know how much insight you have into the inner workings of all these people we've been talking about. But do you think that there's still a lot of daylight between, let's say, the Bannon Navarro and the Steve Mnuchin Lighthizer? I mean, do you think that, or are they kind of, is there a bit more of a unifying, what do you know?
I don't know, but my sense is that the president has enormous confidence in Lighthizer, and so I think that of any cabinet officer who's going to lead these negotiations, he's the one I would want in charge if looking at the range of options.
Got it. Okay, why don't we start in the front row? We have almost a half an hour, so hopefully we get all your questions. We get a microphone to this gentleman here. If you can just say who you are and.
Good morning.
It's on, yep.
Good morning. I'm Mark Daly. And Wendy, I have a question for you, actually a two-part question. Your comment about the having a coalition to negotiate against or with China. The first part of it is, isn't that what WTO is? And the second part is, was it a mistake to allow, in hindsight, was it a mistake to allow China to come in 2001 or so as a developing country?
I think you have strong feelings on that one, don't you?
So with respect to working with other countries, that could be done through the WTO, but frankly, it could be done through ad hoc coalitions on different issues. Earlier this year, we put out a paper in the Asia Society putting forward a range of options on how we could work with other countries using existing international organizations or coalitions like the G20, for example, like APEC, like the WTO. But also, we could work on issues on an ad hoc basis and work with different countries. We could have different coalitions depending on the issue as well. So again, I think the WTO is one option, but I think we all need to be honest about the WTO. I mean, I love the WTO. I was schooled in the WTO. But with 164 members, the notion that they're going to be making an agreement among all of those countries of anything substantive, really meaningful dealing with China in the coming months or year, I find that just hard to believe. And so I think the notion of trying, to work with sets of countries on different issues makes more sense. And the WTO is recognizing that by having what they call plurilateral negotiations going on, where a subset of WTO members are negotiating. With respect to your second question, and this has now become a very hot topic in the trade world, in the WTO, there's no list of developing countries, unlike other international organizations. So countries basically self-declare themselves and say, I'm a developing country. This has not really worked. Maybe it worked well for the GATT and the WTO early on, but it's kind of not working well now when 2/3 of the WTO members, including countries like Singapore, China, and others, are claiming they're developing countries. And so the administration has been upfront that this needs to be changed. They've put forward a proposal which hasn't been, let's be honest, not that well received by other countries, coming up with criteria of which countries qualify as a developing country versus do not qualify. But I would say when China entered the WTO, we never recognized them as a developing country. They self-declared themselves. But even if at that point I think one could make an argument, at least there, because their per capita income, everything about their economy in 2001 was very different than 2019. It's hard to look at the numbers now and to argue that they remain a developing country. The United States has put out an executive order and basically says if this issue isn't basically resolved with China and other countries, that the U.S. is going to take action at the end of October. I don't know what that action is, but this is another real weakness of the WTO. And so when people are looking at reforming the WTO, they really need to get a handle on this one.
Frank Brown.
Thanks, Tom and Wendy. I worry, given the presidential egos at play on both sides, And given the posturing and positions, the only way for this to be resolved is a win-win. How's that possible? How do both sides publicly declare victory, which is sure what Trump is going to demand? And I don't see how Xi Jinping shows any sign of weakness. So I worry long-term impacts driven by that.
I take a few, or okay.
Go ahead.
So yeah, I worry too. I don't think win-win is in our president's vocabulary. And when you're a trade negotiator, one of the first things you learn, it has to be win-win. Because and I've negotiated trade agreements with countries that, like, they did not want to be across the table from the United States. So what they'll do is they'll negotiate with you, and I swear, at the same time they're negotiating, they have other people in their government working about how they're, like, not going to live up to this agreement or how they're going to circumvent it. And so if the other country doesn't feel they got anything from the agreement, it really complicates their ability to sell the agreement and get the support they need at home. But also, it calls into question whether they're going to really implement this in good faith. And I would just say, just as a side issue, I think that's why the administration is spot on emphasizing the importance of a strong enforcement mechanism in this deal. But I do think we need, this will need to be win-win. And what I would hope is that if and when a deal is reached, that China, for its own reasons, will be able to say these reforms that are in this agreement are things that we've been working on for a while. They're in the long-term, medium and long-term interest of the health of our own economy. Mm-hmm. This was the way we were going. So this is a win for us. So I think there is a way you can characterize a deal as a win, but I would hope that whoever writes our president's talking points, allows China, to claim that it has won something from this deal as well.
As opposed to we win, you lose. Why don't we do this, because there's so many hands? Let's take these in threes. Why don't we take the little triangle right here. If you can be as brief as possible, we'll still try to get everyone. Yeah.
Ken Wasserman, could you go into greater detail on the specific unfair trade practices that we're objecting to, and who are the perpetrators? Is it the companies? Is it Chinese law? Is it the government or something else?
Okay.
Hi, Wendy. I just wanted to ask if you thought there was an opportunity for the United States perhaps to rejoin TPP in all of these discussions. That was the original non-tariff way to pressure China, so wondering what you think about that.
You spoke earlier about Vietnam being caught in the crossfires. Is it possible that with like a recession on the horizon in the U.S., that all of this kind of strengthens the economy across Asia, and the U.S. Just kind of loses out from being the sort of first place economy in the world?
Okay.
Oh, good questions.
Okay.
Where do you want to begin?
Okay,
I've got them if you've...
Okay. So, in terms of the unfair trading practices of China, I mean, hundreds of pages have been written about this by the United States, so let me just be brief. I think if you read through these documents, what the United States is alleging with a lot of backup evidence is that China has been forcing the technology transfer. They're forcing U.S. companies to turn over their trade secrets, their IPR, their source codes to their Chinese joint venture partners or other Chinese partners. This is called forced technology transfer, and it needs to change. Also, that China's IPR, intellectual property protection, their protections, their enforcement is subpar and needs to be improved, not only in the copyright and patent area, but in the trade secret area and in other areas. With respect to cyber and trade secret theft, that's another issue that's on the table. So, and on top of that, I would just add the issues of unfair subsidies, unfair financial assistance being given by the government to state-owned enterprises creates an unlevel playing field, and just other practices associated with the market-based economy. But I think your second question, when you ask who are the perpetrators, and I would say it's kind of all of the above. And this has always been a challenge for, taking a WTO case, frankly. In the WTO, you really need to show that the government has their hand in all of this. And it is hard to show because China does argue, look, your companies are giving over their technology for, in order to get this investment or to pursue a joint venture. And our companies will say, well, we have no choice, and it's very clear to us that we don't do this. There are joint venture partners telling us they're going to go elsewhere, and they have the backing of their government to go elsewhere. So it does get muddy here, but I would say it's kind of all of the above. With respect to the U.S. rejoining the TPP, I've been asked that question so many times. There was about a year and a half ago, I think for 48 hours, President Trump toyed with the idea. And there was so much press about that. Are we going to rejoin? Is he interested? And then it kind of, he made it very clear that that was no longer on the table. So as long as he's president, we won't be rejoining TPP. I think certain presidential candidates, including Biden, have expressed an interest in maybe rejoining a TPP, but also improving it. My personal view is that in a new administration, this is something that should be looked at. But I really feel that the TPP rules would really need to be updated. Some of these rules have been negotiated 5 years ago or 8 years ago, in areas like digital trade, which have changed dramatically. And, we also might want to look at having other partners join. But I think a lot will depend on, where we are, which issues would be on the table, and do we have the domestic support for a negotiation like this? As someone who worked on TPP and was kind of disappointed after we brought the deal home about the lack of support and the, great criticism of TPP, I will tell you, in the past year or two, I've met with a lot of, a handful of people in Congress and industry. And kind of people remember themselves as strong TPP supporters, and I kind of remind them they kind of weren't there then. So it seems with time the TPP is looking better and better.
And then Vietnam.
Yeah.
And is there a ripple effect that might be good for Southeast Asia here?
Well, I think your question more was like, would it be good for the United States if, and here's the deal. I think if we have a recession in the United States, this is not good for the global economy, particularly at a time when other countries are going into global recessions, or at least, their economic growth rates are pretty low. And so we want everyone to be healthy, including the United States. But the second part of your question is, I do think that by not engaging in Asia in these trade agreements, trying to do them bilaterally, not being part of the TPP's successor, CPTPP, not being part of the RCEP negotiations, I think that what we're seeing is other countries continue to negotiate among themselves, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region. We are not part of these agreements, and as a result, we lose in that benefits are negotiated to be given to the participants. So if you're in that circle, you get the benefits. If you're outside of that circle, like the United States now, we don't get the benefits. And competition is hard in this world, and you could have the best product, but there's a lot of competition from companies all around the world. And then if you're disadvantaged with respect to trade agreements, it's hard to stay in that market and maintain your market share. And what I have heard, and particularly from farmers, but not limited to agriculture, it's once you lose that market share, you don't gain it back overnight. It takes time. It took you time to build that market share. And once other suppliers are found or other sources are found, it's hard and it takes time to kind of rebuild your presence in any market. And our farmers have seen that, and that's why you hear them, complain and express concern, throughout all of this trade tit for tat and these trade wars, is because they are losing market share in key markets. We haven't mentioned Japan, but I think there will be a U.S.-Japan kind of mini deal announced here in New York in a few weeks. And at least there, I think that, particularly in the agriculture sector, that U.S. farmers will regain access to the Japanese market, which is going to be very important.
Okay, I think this gentleman had a question, and then I've been not nice to the back of the room. So why don't we take the two back there, we'll do, and you, sir.
Hi, Rick Newman with Yahoo Finance. Can you just offer your best guess about the Chinese strategy at this point? Do you think they really might just wait this out until there's, the U.S. Presidential election next year, or do they want to get out of this as well?
And then the two gentlemen next to one another there. Yep.
Yeah. Is this on?
Yes, it is.
Richard Davies, podcaster. You talked about the importance of working level negotiations. What is the caliber of U.S. negotiators, in your opinion, and is there a split in their in their view of China and how to proceed?
Good morning. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Wendy. My name is Matt Hayes with Griffin Strategies. We focus on political risk and business intelligence work. And Wendy, just wondering if you could elaborate more on what you're hearing from your contacts at the American, in the American business community who have operations in China. On one hand, as you mentioned, you hear about companies looking to diversify their supply chains and pick up operations and looking to go to countries like Vietnam and Bangladesh. But then recently, a U.S.-China Business Council poll came out and said, a vast majority of their companies are hunkering down and just waiting this out, knowing that there might be a new administration or Trump is looking for a win. So just wondering what you're hearing on the ground there. Thank you.
You see, this program doesn't need a moderator. She just had all questions from the audience.
I feel like
great
I'm in
questions.
my final exams here. Yeah. And now I'm really going to give you a quiz on the tariffs.
Yeah.
Okay.
So what's China's strategy?
Okay. Yeah, so I'm sure they're having really interesting internal meetings, and I'm sure there are people who are advocating we just need to wait this out. How can we do a deal with this president when we think we're close to a deal, or we think we had a constructive round of talks? The response is to put more tariffs on, and so we've seen what the president's done with Mexico and other countries. Maybe we're just better off waiting this out. I think others would say, no, we don't know, who the next president will be. And Trump, I think, made it clear yesterday that if he succeeds in winning another term, he's going to be even tougher on China. So they better come forward now. But I also think that China, for its own reasons, would like a deal. I mean, its economy is hurting. Its manufacturing output is hurting. It's, you can just look throughout its economy. Its economy was experiencing its own difficulties regardless of this tariff war, and this tariff war is clearly having an adverse impact on its economic growth, job creation, et cetera. So I think it all gets down to what are the terms of this deal? We talk, does China want a deal? Well, I think China would like a deal if it was on its terms. I think the U.S. would like a deal if it was on its terms. And this, again, is where, both sides need to find that middle ground. And that's why these negotiations are so important. And so let me then I think this is a good transition to the next question. When I'm talking about kind of working level negotiators, I'm talking about, the non-political appointees. So basically be under the vice minister level at USTR and other agencies. And I think there I have the highest praise for the caliber of U.S. negotiators. U.S. trade negotiators, having been one, I'll tell you, no one works harder than U.S. trade negotiators. If you work with Asia, as many of you know in this room, but if you're a trade negotiator, you're working 24 hours a day. And I just remember, for example, working with countries during the TPP, and I'd go to, I'd come home from work, have a glass of wine,
PTSD,
decompress,
right?
PTSD, then get on the phone with a counterpart, and they'd have all their questions and what happened all day in the U.S., go to sleep for 5 hours, 6 hours, and I would hate to read my email in the morning, because if they had a bad day, then my day, the next day starting that morning, was going to be awful. I would end up cleaning up what they had done, or having to get an answer to questions that no one could really answer. So I can't underscore for people enough what a professional, hardworking, and really skillful caliber of trade negotiators we have. And I would also say that the turnover, particularly at USTR, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, the office where I worked, the turnover in the Trump administration has been, pretty modest. And so a lot of the veteran negotiators are still there. I mean, it's generational. People are retiring and moving on, but, there's not like a mass exodus of people. And so I think that's a real tribute to Ambassador Lighthizer and his team. And the last one about, U.S. companies, I'm glad you referenced the latest poll by the U.S.-China Business Council. And I think something that is very interesting that we need to keep in mind when we talk about how the U.S. business community is, that trades and invests in China, how they're responding to all of this. You really need to distinguish between those companies that are in China to sell to China, or those that are exporting and really using China as part of kind of their global supply chain. And I think depending where you are, you have kind of different views on, the China trade war, or you have different views on what the uncertainty is doing, or you're being impacted more or less. And I think that's one of the reasons when I was very surprised when I read the U.S.-China Business Council, their survey. They had a very high percentage of companies that were just going to stay in China. I think it was about 17, 18% that were talking about leaving, but of those 18%, only 3% were talking about coming back to the United States. So I don't think we can talk about the U.S. business community as a monolith here, but I will tell you, U.S. companies are really struggling now trying to figure out how to adjust their supply chains, how to deal with this uncertainty, and trying to map out where this is all headed. And something I would just say, all the time they spend on this is at the expense of other work they could be doing, like innovating their products and R&D. I know it's not the same people and the companies that do all of this, but I think we all need to recognize that. There is a trade-off when your supply chains are really in jeopardy, or at least under attack. And I think that's something we need to keep in mind. I did want to just say one thing before I leave. When I heard this morning that this round in October was going to be the 13th round of the trade negotiations, I was thinking, can't this be like an elevator and we skip 13? We call it 14?
There is a question online that is relevant to what you were just saying about, and to the question about American companies and their strategies. It's a bit more of a political question, I guess, but Emily online asks, given all this pain that is starting to be felt here, would that then perhaps drive concessions in negotiations on the U.S. side before the next presidential election? And I guess the calculus is the president has played to the base a lot and stuck to a promise by standing up to the Chinese. But we also know he watches the stock market. He will, there's core heartland America that's affected here. What about that question? I mean,
and that's a great question, and I think that's what China is betting on. And it's a question of who has the wherewithal in this, who can outlast the other. And I think China's, watching the election coming up and thinking that, looking where this is headed. And, again, when you look at the tariff increases that may be in place by the end of this year, they're going to be hurting like every American. It won't just be U.S. businesses. It's going to be every consumer, or almost every consumer. And so I think what China's betting on is that they can somehow weather this through in their economic and political system, but it's the U.S.'s that's going to need a deal. And so therefore, the U.S. then may be more flexible on some of the demands it's making. And that's the calculus that's going on in both capitals now. Who has the upper hand? Who is the leverage? Who can outlast the other?
We want to be faithful to the hour. We like to stick to these so folks can get back to their desks in due time and wrap it by 9:30. Just a quick note that the next edition of the Asia Breakfast Briefing series will travel way to the west of the continent to Afghanistan. As you may know, there's talk of a peace agreement of some kind that's been negotiated by the United States to withdraw troops from Afghanistan. There's also an election looming. We will have here as our special guest in October the ambassador from Afghanistan to the United Nations, who also happens to be one of the highest-ranking women diplomats from that country. That's in October. And of course, for all the reasons I mentioned in the introduction, we hope to see you here before then. And please join me in thanking our PTSD sufferer, Wendy Cutler. Thank you.
Thank you.